Chapter 1. Introduction. Torture as a Universal Phenomenon of Humanity. The history of humanity is not only a history of progress, culture, and civilization, but also a history of violence and oppression. Among the many manifestations of violence, torture occupies a special place. It is a phenomenon that runs through almost all epochs and cultures. Hardly any society, from the earliest advanced civilizations to the present day, is conceivable without practices of torture. And yet it has changed over the centuries, in its forms, in its justifications, and in its social role. Torture refers to the deliberate infliction of pain, physical or psychological, with a specific purpose. This purpose could be different: to force confessions, obtain information, impose punishments, intimidate enemies, or demonstrate power. Unlike spontaneous violence, torture was a planned, institutional action embedded in political, legal, or religious systems. From the early advanced civilizations to the modern world, torture has played a paradoxical role. On the one hand, it was considered a legitimate means of exercising power, a necessary tool of order and justice. On the other hand, it has always aroused disgust, led to criticism, and left deep traces in cultural memory. This tension between legitimization and moral rejection accompanies the history of torture to this day. It is particularly revealing that torture was never just a purely barbaric phenomenon of past times. Even highly developed cultures that praised freedom, reason, or human dignity resorted to torture when they considered it necessary. The Greeks, who invented democracy, tortured their slaves to gain truth. Rome, which had a highly developed legal system, made torture an integral part of its judicial practice. The Christian Middle Ages, dedicated to charity, established torture as a tool of the Inquisition. And even in modernity, which upholds human rights, it did not disappear. It only became more sophisticated, more hidden, more psychological. The legitimation of torture has always been a mirror of the respective society. In Antiquity, it served to demonstrate state power. In the Middle Ages, it was justified religiously. In modern times, it was justified by security interests or reasons of state. But it always remained an expression of domination. Those who had power decided on whom they could inflict pain in order to enforce obedience, order, or truth. However, this story is not only a story of the perpetrators, but also of the victims. The screams of the tortured, the scars they carried, and the memories they left behind are also part of our heritage. Torture has always been a means of dehumanization. It was intended to break the body, destroy the will, and reduce the human being to an object of violence. At the same time, the history of torture has always been accompanied by criticism, resistance, and reform. Even in ancient times, philosophers doubted their suitability for truth. In the Middle Ages, there were lawyers who warned against abuse. In the Enlightenment, thinkers such as Cesare Beccaria raised their voices against cruelty. And in the 20th century, the horrors of the Gestapo, gulags, and secret services led to the codification of international norms against torture. Today, torture is officially prohibited worldwide. Treaties such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, or the UN Convention Against Torture, 1984, unequivocally state that torture cannot be justified in any situation. And yet, a look at the present shows that the practice has not disappeared. In many countries, under the pretext of security, counterterrorism, or discipline, torture continues. The history of torture is therefore more than a look into the dark chapters of the past. It is also a reminder of the present, that progress and humanity cannot be taken for granted, but must be defended again and again. It shows how thin the line between law and violence, between order and cruelty can be. This script aims to trace the development of torture in broad lines, from the early advanced civilizations to Greece and Rome, the Middle Ages, and modern times to the modern age. It shows the different forms, functions, and legitimations of torture, and at the same time asks, why is it so persistent? And what does it say about us as people and societies? Torture is a universal phenomenon, and this is precisely where its historical significance lies. Telling their story means recognizing the abyss in humanity, but also the long struggle for dignity, rights, and freedom. Chapter 2. Early Advanced Civilizations. Torture in Ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. The origins of torture go back as far as the early state communities themselves. Even in the first advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, there are indications that pain was used systematically, whether for punishment, deterrence, or to force confessions. These early societies laid the foundations for an understanding of law and order in which torture had a firm place. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, law was recorded in codified form. The most famous example is the Codex Hammurabi from the 18th century BC, one of the oldest known legal texts in the world. Although it does not explicitly mention torture as an interrogation method, the punishments provided for there show a clear awareness of the power of pain. Corporal punishment, mutilation, and executions were part of the legal system. The idea of retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, suggested that violence was a legitimate means of justice. In Mesopotamia, torture was not only used for punishment, but also for control. Prisoners and suspects were often subject to harsh physical measures to bring the truth to light. Although the sources are fragmentary, it can be assumed that beatings, branding, and other tortures were used to force confessions. In addition, torture functioned as a public spectacle. The display of the punished served as a deterrent and a demonstration of royal power. In ancient Egypt, torture was closely linked to the idea of order and cosmic justice, the ma'at. This order was not to be disturbed, and any violation of it was severely punished. Here, too, there are references to corporal punishment that went beyond mere punishment. Papyrus finds and reliefs show scenes of prisoners being beaten with sticks, tied up, or humiliated in other ways. Especially in the case of treason or conspiracies against the pharaoh, torture was used to expose accomplices and force confessions. A notorious example is the harem conspiracy under Ramses III in the 12th century BC. According to the surviving court records, the conspirators were cruelly interrogated and punished, many probably under torture. The gall was not only the truth, but also the public demonstration of the inviolable power of the pharaoh. In Egypt, too, torture had a ritual dimension. Prisoners from wars were often paraded and publicly mistreated. Depictions show how defeated enemies were bound, beaten, or even mutilated. This was not only punishment, but also a symbolic act. The physical torment of the enemy represented the restoration of divine order. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, torture was thus associated with the early idea of law and rule. It was a tool of power that worked on different levels, as a means of establishing the truth, as a form of punishment, and as a staging of political control. Pain was institutionalized. It was not just an act of spontaneous violence, but part of a conscious strategy to order society and secure power. This early intertwining of law, religion, and violence was to shape the history of torture for thousands of years. Even here, a pattern emerges that recurs again and again. The infliction of suffering was not understood as arbitrariness, but as justified action in the name of justice, gods, or rulers. Chapter 3. Greece and the ambivalent attitude to torture. Ancient Greece is considered by many to be the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and Western culture. And yet, torture was also part of his everyday social life, a fact that illustrates the contradiction between high ideals and cruel reality. The attitude of the Greeks to torture was characterized by a particular ambivalence. On the one hand, it was considered a legitimate means. On the other hand, it was philosophically and morally questioned. In the Greek legal system, torture was closely linked to people's status. Free citizens were not allowed to be tortured without further ado. Their bodies were considered inviolable. Slaves, on the other hand, had no protection. They were considered property and could be beaten, tortured, or killed at any time. This played a decisive role, especially in the legal context. The testimony of a slave in court only had weight if it had been coerced by torture. It was assumed that the truth would only be told in agony. Thus, torture became an institutionalized element of the Greek judiciary. If a slave was needed as a witness, he was subjected to torture in order to obtain a confession or testimony. This belief in finding the truth through pain was deeply rooted, even if in practice it often led to forced, untrue statements. Torture also played a role in political life. In times of unrest or conspiracies, suspects were tortured to unmask accomplices. Especially in Athens, where the democratic system was based on the participation of the citizens, loyalty was secured by harsh measures. Democracy for free men therefore existed only on the basis of the lack of freedom and torture of slaves. At the same time, a reflection on the legitimacy of such practices developed in Greek philosophy. Plato already expressed doubts about the reliability of statements under torture. Pain, he argued, could make people say anything, true or false. Other thinkers, including Aristotle, also discussed the problem of whether torment could actually bring truths to light. These considerations show that there was already an awareness of the problem, even if they did not fundamentally end the practice. In addition to judicial torture, there were also cruel punishments, which today would clearly be described as torture. Physical abuse, branding, mutilation, and public humiliation were part of the punishment practice. In times of war, prisoners were often tortured or exhibited as a warning example. Such actions had a clear message. They demonstrated the power of the victors and the powerlessness of the vanquished. It is interesting that the Greeks also developed a great interest in the self-control of the body. In philosophy, sport, and asceticism, it was considered the ideal to endure pain and control the body. This gave torture a double meaning. On the one hand, it was a tool of domination, and on the other hand, it was a touchstone of steadfastness. Those who endured torment showed virtue. Those who broke revealed weakness. The Greek attitude to torture thus remains contradictory. In practice, it was firmly embedded in the legal system, especially in relation to slaves. In his thinking, however, the first doubts germinated, which were later to be taken up again in the Enlightenment. This contradiction between reality and reflection makes Greek antiquity an important chapter in the history of torture. It shows how much even a culture that praised freedom and reason was permeated by violence, and how early the first criticism nevertheless. Chapter 4. Rome, Torture as an Instrument of Law and Power. If the Greeks viewed torture ambivalently, the Romans elevated it to an integral part of their legal system and their exercise of power. Hardly any other ancient culture used torture as systematically as Rome. It was not only a tool of the criminal justice system, but also a means of demonstrating power and cementing social differences. In Roman law, the position of the individual was decisive. Free Roman citizens theoretically enjoyed protection from torture. Their physical integrity was considered inviolable, and they could only be tortured in exceptional cases, such as in cases of high treason. This protection did not apply to non-citizens, foreigners, and especially to slaves. They could be subjected to torture at any time, whether for punishment, intimidation, or to establish the truth. The use of torture in court proceedings was particularly typical. Statements by slaves had evidential value in Roman courts only if they had been obtained under torture. It was believed that pain destroyed the lie and brought the truth to light. This thinking led to countless people being tortured in order to force confessions or testimonies, even if these were often questionable in practice. The methods were varied and cruel. Beatings, whippings, and burns were standard. In addition, there were techniques such as tearing with hooks, breaking bones, or slow killing by crucifixion. The infamous crucifixion was not only an execution, but also torture, a long, agonizing death that was publicly celebrated to achieve maximum deterrence. The gladiatorial games also had a connection to torture. Although they were primarily a spectacle, many gladiators were slaves or convicts who had to fight under cruel conditions. The suffering of the combatants became the entertainment of the people. It was a form of ritualized violence that placed body and pain at the center of the public sphere. The Romans used torture not only for their internal order, but also as a weapon of imperial rule. Insurgents in the provinces were tortured to expose co-conspirators and intimidate others. The brutal suppression of the Spartacus uprising, with the crucifixion of thousands of slaves along the Appian Way, is an impressive example. Here, torture was combined with a demonstration of political power. Nevertheless, torture did not remain without criticism in Rome either. Philosophers such as Seneca or Stoics emphasized the dignity of the human being and advised leniency in dealing with slaves. But even they did not fundamentally question the institution. They only appealed to the humanity of the gentleman without condemning the practice itself. The Roman culture of torture shows a significant ambivalence. On the one hand, a highly developed legal system that formulated principles of justice and civil rights. On the other hand, the systematic use of the most cruel practices against all those who stood outside the status of citizens. Freedom and justice applied only to a few. For the rest, violence and torture were a constant threat. Rome made torture an integral part of law and power. It was not a sign of arbitrariness, but institutionalized, regulated, and publicly staged. This was precisely where its effectiveness lay. It was the expression of an order based on hierarchy, submission, and violence. And in this sense, Rome became a model for many later societies that regarded torture as a necessary tool of state power. Chapter 5. Torture in Early Christianity, Victims and Martyrs. With the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, the history of torture took on a new dimension. While it had previously been primarily a tool of the state's exercise of power, it now also became a symbol of religious persecution and a touchstone of faith. The early Christians, who lived in a pagan majority society, were repeatedly targeted by state repression, and torture played a central role in this context. The Roman authorities initially viewed the new religion with suspicion. Christians refused to worship the emperor and the Roman gods, which was considered disloyalty and a threat to the state order. In times of political crisis or social tension, waves of persecution occurred again and again. Torture served as a means of forcing confessions, breaking the faith, or publicly punishing martyrs. The sources report cruel methods. Christians were scourged, harnessed to stretching benches, burned with red-hot iron, or thrown to wild animals in the circus. Especially in the large arenas, torture became a public staging. The suffering of Christians should not only punish themselves, but also deter others. But Christianity turned this suffering into a message of strength. For many believers, the torments of the martyrs were proof of the truth of their faith. Those who remained steadfast under torture and preferred to die rather than renounce their faith became role models and heroes. Names such as Perpetua, Felicitas, Ignatius of Antioch, or later Polycarp of Smyrna went down in history. Their stories were written down, disseminated, and read aloud in the congregations. This gave torture a paradoxical effect. What the Romans had thought of as a means of intimidation and destruction was used by Christians as a source of inspiration and identity. The blood of the martyrs, it was said, was the seed of the church. Over time, this developed into a veritable martyr theology. The suffering was no longer just endured, but interpreted as participation in the suffering of Christ. Jesus himself had been tortured and crucified. Those who followed him in torment were considered particularly close to God. This religious interpretation gave torture a spiritual dimension. It became the touchstone of faith and the chance for eternal reward. At the same time, this created an ambivalent relationship between Christianity and torture. On the one hand, Christians condemned the cruelty of their persecutors and opposed violence. On the other hand, they elevated suffering to an ideal that remained effective even within the church. Later, when Christianity itself became the state religion, torture returned in another form, this time not against Christians, but in their name against infidels and heretics. The early persecution of Christians shows how torture not only causes physical suffering, but also creates cultural and religious meanings. It was an instrument of oppression, but also a stage for resistance, steadfastness, and faith. The image of the tortured but steadfast martyr left a lasting mark on Christian culture and was to play a role for centuries to come, both as an inspiration for sacrifice and as a justification for later violence in the name of the Church. Chapter 6. The Germanic Tribes and the Early Middle Ages. With the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Germanic tribes, the way torture was dealt with also changed. While torture was strongly institutionally integrated and legally regulated in Rome, a hybrid form of old tribal traditions, Christian thought, and the remnants of Roman law developed in the post-Roman empires. The result was an ambivalent system in which torture continued to exist, but in a different form. Before their Christianization, the Germanic tribes had a legal practice that was strongly influenced by clan, honor, and blood revenge. Punishment served primarily to restore order and balance. Fines, the so-called Wehrgeld, were often used to compensate for offenses. Corporal punishment and cruel forms of killing did exist, but the systematic use of torture to establish the truth initially played a minor role. With the spread of Christianity and the influence of Roman legal traditions, this changed. The early Middle Ages knew various methods to determine guilt or innocence, including the so-called divine judgments. The decision about guilt or truth was placed in the hands of God. One defendant had to carry a red-hot iron or get into the water, for example. If he survived or remained unharmed, he was considered innocent. Even if this is not directly to be understood as torture in the strict sense, it was nevertheless a form of painful examination that served the purpose of finding the truth. At the same time, torture continued to develop as a punitive measure in the kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. Especially in the case of betrayal, riot, or serious crimes, cruel methods were used both to punish the perpetrator and to intimidate the community. Executions were staged in public, mutilations served as a deterrent, and were intended to ensure social peace. With the rise of the Church, the religious dimension of torture gained in importance. Although Christianity preached charity, in practice, heretics, pagans, or sorcerers were repeatedly victims of cruel interrogations. Canon law and secular law intertwined, and so a legal tradition arose in which torture became a means of preserving divine order. An example of this are the Frankish kingdoms. Under Charlemagne, for example, who wanted to unite the Christian West, Saxon uprisings were brutally suppressed. Prisoners were tortured or executed en masse in order to break the resistance and enforce Christianization. Here, violence had not only a legal function, but also a missionary one. The early Middle Ages were therefore a transitional period. It combined old tribal customs, Roman legal concepts, and Christian theology. This resulted in a system in which torture was no longer regulated exclusively by law, but served at the same time as a divine means of testing and as a political weapon. Particularly formative was the idea that pain and suffering were part of a higher order. Anyone who confessed to torture was not only considered legally convicted, but also spiritually exposed by God's will. This combination of faith and violence was to reach its climax in the High Middle Ages, in the institutional anchoring of torture in the context of the Inquisition and the witch trials. The early Middle Ages thus laid the foundation for an era in which torture was not only accepted, but systematized on a large scale. The path to this goal led through the fusion of law, religion, and rule, a triangle that was to shape the history of torture for centuries. Chapter 7. The High Middle Ages. Institutionalization of torture in the legal system. In the High Middle Ages, the history of torture reached a decisive turning point. Whereas previously it was often unsystematic, regionally limited, or strongly influenced by tribal customs, it has now become increasingly institutionalized and an integral part of jurisprudence in Europe. This did not happen by chance, but in the context of profound changes: the strengthening of central rule, the growing power of the church, and the formation of clear legal systems. Until the 12th century, torture was rarely included in formal proceedings in many parts of Europe. But with the resurgence of Roman law, especially by the legal scholars in Bologna, came a paradigm shift. The old Roman ideas that torture could be considered a legitimate means of establishing the truth were rediscovered and integrated into European legal culture. Lawyers argued that without a confession, no complete evidence was possible. However, since confessions were rarely made voluntarily, torture seemed to be an indispensable tool. This development received additional momentum from the Church. Pope Innocent IV published the bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252, which allowed the use of torture to combat heresy, under certain conditions. This was a decisive moment, as it legitimized and regulated torture by the highest ecclesiastical authority. Although the document stipulated that the lives and limbs of the tortured should be spared, in practice it led to the widespread use of brutal methods. In the secular sphere, torture found its place in the embarrassing court order. It was part of the Inquisition process, which, in its search for the truth, did not rely on evidence in the modern sense, but on confessions. A confession was considered the queen of evidence. To force it, defendants were harnessed to stretching benches, tortured with thumbscrews, abused with water or fire. The methods were systematized, refined, and documented. A special feature of this period was formalization. Torture was no longer an act of arbitrariness, but bound by certain rules. It could only be used in cases of serious suspicion. A judge often had to be present, and theoretically, it should not lead to death. But these rules offered little protection. In practice, they were easily circumvented, and many defendants did not survive the torment. Torture was not only a legal tool, but also a means of domination. It showed the power of the authorities over the body of the subject. Those who were tortured experienced firsthand that they were completely at the mercy of the control of state and church. Publicly staged torture also had an educational function. It was intended to deter the population and ensure obedience. Despite the cruelty, there were also critical voices in the High Middle Ages. Some theologians and jurists warned of abuse or doubted the reliability of confessions under agony. But these concerns remained in the minority. For most contemporaries, torture was a necessary evil to ensure truth, order, and divine justice. The High Middle Ages thus marked the transition from sporadic use to the systematic institutionalization of torture. It became part of the law, sanctioned by church and state, and had a profound impact on European societies. This foundation prepared the ground for the excesses that were to follow in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, especially in connection with the witch trials and the Inquisition. Chapter 8. Witch Trials and Inquisition. Torture as finding the truth. Hardly any other era is so strongly associated with the image of torture as the time of the witch trials and the Inquisition. Between the 13th and 17th centuries, Europe experienced a wave of persecutions in which tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed. This period marked the culmination of the institutionalization of torture as a tool of truth. The medieval Inquisition was originally intended as an ecclesiastical trial against heresy. Their goal was to convict dissenters from the faith and to preserve the unity of the Church. Early on, torture was used to force confessions. With the bull Ad Extirpanda of Pope Innocent IV, 1252, the use of torture was expressly permitted. From then on, it became an integral part of inquisitional processes. In the 15th and 16th centuries, this system extended to the persecution of witches. Witchcraft was considered a particularly dangerous crime because it was directed not only against society but also against God himself. Suspicions could arise from small things: unusual behavior, social outsider role, conflicts with neighbors. In particular, women who lived alone, knew what to do, or were outside the norm were easily suspected. The proceedings followed a typical pattern. First, circumstantial evidence was collected. Then there was arrest and interrogation. Since it was almost impossible to prove innocence, torture was the decisive step. In agony, the defendants confessed to everything their judges wanted to hear: the pact with the devil, nocturnal flights, spells, or participation in the witch's Sabbath. The methods were varied and cruel. Stretching benches, thumb screws, torture chairs with iron tips, water samples, and fire torture were part of the repertoire. Psychological torture also played a role: hours of interrogation, sleep deprivation, threats against family and children. The aim was not only to confess, but also to name co-conspirators. In this way, the persecution spread like wildfire. Every name mentioned under torture led to new charges. The Inquisition and the witch trials exemplify how torture could be misused as an instrument to establish the truth. In agony, the defendants said what their tormentors expected. This resulted in entire networks of alleged covens that did not exist in reality. Torture did not create truth, but a self-reinforcing system of suspicions and confessions. The consequences were devastating. In Europe, tens of thousands of people fell victim to the witch hunts, and in some regions, entire village communities. Women were particularly affected, not only because they were accused more often, but also because their social status made them vulnerable. The witch trials are therefore also an example of gender-based violence and the role of torture in it. At the same time, this epoch was an expression of deep social fears. Epidemics, famines, wars, and social crises searched for explanations, and found them in the construction of evil in the form of the witch. Torture served here not only as a legal tool, but also as a psychological outlet. It offered an apparent answer to the inexplicable by making the guilty visible and punishing them. In retrospect, the witch trials and the Inquisition appear to be the culmination of an irrational cruelty. But they were also the result of a system that had institutionalized torture and considered it indispensable for establishing the truth. It was only with the clarification and the growing doubts about the reliability of confessions under torture that this foundation was to begin to falter. The witch trials are thus a dark chapter in European history, an example of how torture was used not only as a means of power, but also as an expression of collective fear and delusions. Chapter 9. Public Torture and Executions, Spectacle of Power. Torture played a central role during the Inquisition and witch trials, but it was not limited to the courtroom. In the Middle Ages and the early modern period, torture was also a public spectacle, a demonstration of power that was intended to make people vividly aware of who ruled over life and death. The stage for this was the market squares, gallows hills, and city squares of Europe, where executions and tortures became an integral part of social life. Public torture was a ritual that went far beyond the punishment of the individual. It was an act of communication between rulers and subjects. Those who were tortured and executed embodied the order that had been violated, and their punishment was intended to symbolically restore that order. The body of the delinquent became the medium of power. This is particularly evident in the so-called embarrassing punishments. These included flogging, mutilation, branding, and breaking on the wheel. The condemned man was often led through the city, exhibited in the pillory, or tortured to death in front of the assembled population. Each torment had a meaning. Pulling out the tongue punished blasphemy. Cutting off the hands punished theft. Wheeling, treason, or murder. A particularly notorious example was the execution in 1610 of the French regicide François Ravaillac, who had assassinated King Henry IV. He was publicly tortured with red-hot tongs, his body was doused with boiling oil and sulfur, and finally torn apart by 4 horses. The crowd watched the gruesome spectacle for hours. Such executions were supposed to embody the terrible power of the state, and they did it through the body of the condemned. But the public was not only spectators, but part of the spectacle. The executions were social events for which entire cities gathered. Merchants sold food, children watched curiously, preachers took the opportunity for moral admonitions. For many people, it was a form of entertainment, but also an act of collective affirmation of order. At the same time, however, the spectacle could also tip over. It happened that the audience felt pity for the condemned person or even mocked the authorities when the torture failed or became too grotesque. Sometimes executions became places of protest where the crowd questioned the authority of the rulers. Public torture was therefore a risky ritual. It was intended to consolidate power, but it could also undermine its legitimacy. Symbolism played a central role in these spectacles. The body of the condemned man was not only a physical object, but a sign. His dismemberment, burning, or display made it visible that order had been restored. Michel Foucault, the great French philosopher, described this practice as a politics of pain. Power inscribed itself in the body by destroying it. In the course of the early modern period, however, a change began to emerge. With the rise of the Enlightenment and new ideas of humanity, criticism of public torture grew. Executions were still carried out, but increasingly in a less cruel form. The spectacular torture was replaced by prison as a place of punishment. But until the 18th century, public torture was a natural part of social life, a reflection of how closely violence, law, and power were intertwined. Public torture was therefore more than a criminal act. It was a ritual of power, a staging of political and social order. She made it visible that domination was exercised not only over words and laws, but also over the body, and that this violence played a central role in the self-image of pre-modern societies. Chapter 10. Philosophical and Theological Critique of Torture. As firmly as torture was anchored in the legal system in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, there were always voices that expressed doubts. This criticism was never strong enough to overthrow the system immediately, but it formed the basis for the later upheaval. Philosophers, jurists, and theologians began to question the moral, legal, and practical legitimacy of torture, often in the field of tension between religious conviction, human compassion, and rational skepticism. Even in ancient times, individual thinkers such as Plato or Seneca had pointed out that pain was not a reliable source of truth. But in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, this argumentation gained a new urgency. More and more scholars asked, how can one trust confessions that were forced under unspeakable agony? Doesn't the person in the torture chamber say everything his tormentors want to hear? As early as the 16th century, jurists such as Johann von Schwarzenberg and Andreas Gale pointed out that torture easily led to false confessions. They criticized that this did not confirm the truth, but only the will of the judges. Some theologians also expressed concerns. Was it really compatible with the Christian faith to inflict torment on a person in order to elicit his innermost being? The strongest arguments against torture came in the Age of Enlightenment. Cesare Beccaria, an Italian legal philosopher, published his work De Deliti e delle Pene on crimes and punishments in 1764, in which he condemned torture as barbaric and irrational. For Beccaria, it was clear. Torture violates human dignity and contradicts any logic of justice. An innocent person, he argued, could confess in agony just as much as a guilty person, and thus the trial was useless. Montesquieu also criticized the cruelty of torture in his Spirit of the Law. He asked whether it was not absurd to torture someone in order to find out whether he had committed a crime. Such arguments spread throughout Europe and increasingly shaped public opinion. Religiously, the attitude remained ambivalent. While the Church had legitimized torture for centuries to combat heresy, There were also currents within Christianity that emphasized compassion and charity. Mystics, preachers, and individual theologians recalled that Christ himself had been tortured and crucified, and that it could therefore not be in the spirit of faith to expose others to this suffering. In addition to moral criticism, a growing awareness of humanity and civilization also played a role. The emergent idea of human dignity no longer focused on the human being only as a subject, but as an independent, rational being. In this new image of humanity, torture no longer had a place. However, it took a long time for these thoughts to have practical consequences. Even in the 17th century, witch trials were conducted with the most cruel methods, and torture remained in use in many places in the 18th century. But the criticism could no longer be ignored. It prepared the ground for the major reforms that followed in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The philosophical and theological critique of torture thus marks an important turning point. It shows that even at a time when violence was deeply embedded in the legal system, there was an awareness of its illegitimacy. And it makes it clear that the idea of dignity, freedom, and truth, could end up being stronger than the centuries-old practice of torment. Chapter 11. Early Modern Period, Reformation, Wars, and the Increase in Torture Practices. The early modern period, which lasts from about the 16th to the 17th century, was an era of profound upheavals. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation, religious wars, the strengthening of centralized states, and the struggle for power shaped life in Europe. At the same time, this time was marked by great uncertainty, and whenever there was uncertainty, the powerful liked to resort to violence to restore order. Torture played a key role in this. The Reformation brought with it a wave of religious conflicts. The Catholic Church and the followers of Luther, Zwingli, or Calvin were hostile to each other. Dissenters from the right-wing faith were persecuted in both camps. The Inquisition, persecutions of heretics, and religious courts used torture to force confessions and confessions. The body became the battlefield of faith. Those who did not renounce their own convictions were tortured or executed. This was particularly brutal in the witch hunts, which reached their peak in the early modern period. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, there were veritable waves of witch trials in many regions of Europe. Entire villages were caught up in the maelstrom of hysteria. Under torture, defendants confessed to nocturnal devil pacts, sorcery, or participation in witches' sabbaths. The spiral of violence was self-reinforcing. Every forced statement led to new suspicions, which in turn were confirmed by torture. The wars of this era, especially the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, further strengthened the culture of violence. At a time when armies were plundering the country, hunger and disease were rampant, state and church repression also became tougher. Torture was used to expose alleged spies, punish traitors, or put down riots. In the midst of chaos and hardship, the rulers sought to secure their power through fear. In addition, the states of Europe became increasingly centralized. Kings and princes expanded their authority, and with it the importance of a regulated judiciary grew. In it, torture became a tool of the authorities, the confession the queen of evidence. In almost all European countries, it was now legally permitted and firmly anchored. The methods of torture were refined and systematized during this time. Thumb screws, leg screws, stretching bench, Spanish boot, water torture, or red-hot iron were part of the standard repertoire. Manuals for inquisitors and judges were created, which gave precise instructions on when and how torture could be used. The horror thus took on a form of bureaucratic rationality. At the same time, however, criticism also grew. As early as the 16th century, individual jurists and theologians spoke out, pointing out the unreliability of confessions under torture. Some princes temporarily restricted the practice, others carried out reforms. But the broad institutionalization remained. The early modern period was thus an age of contrasts. On the one hand, the flowering of science, art, and discovery. On the other hand, a climate of fear, persecution, and violence. Torture was part of this ambivalence. It reflected the deep uncertainties of the era and became a tool to get a grip on this uncertainty, albeit in a cruel way. It was not until the rise of the Enlightenment in the 18th century that this system was fundamentally questioned. But until then, torture remained an omnipresent instrument of state and church, a tool that could unfold a special brutality in times of upheaval and war. Chapter 12. Enlightenment and the First Break with the Tradition of Torture. The 18th century brought about an intellectual revolution that changed not only science, politics, and society, but also the relationship to violence. The Enlightenment focused on people with their reason and dignity. In this new way of thinking, torture, which had been a natural part of jurisprudence for centuries, no longer had a place. The Enlightenment posed the question of the legitimacy of torture in a radically new way. Until then, it had been justified by religion, tradition, or reason of state. Now, however, philosophers, lawyers, and publicists appeared who not only criticized individual abuses, but also declared the practice as a whole to be incompatible with justice and humanity. One of the most influential voices was the Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria, who published his work De Delitti et delle Pene on crimes and punishments in 1764. Beccaria argued that torture is not only cruel, but also irrational. An innocent person can confess in agony just as much as a guilty person. The result is therefore not truth, but arbitrariness. For Beccaria, it was a contradiction to commit injustice in the name of justice. His work quickly spread throughout Europe and became the manifesto of a new, more humane criminal justice system. Other thinkers of the Enlightenment also turned against torture. Montesquieu criticized it as a barbaric relic that had no place in a civilized society. In his writings and pamphlets, Voltaire repeatedly drew attention to judicial scandals in which innocent people had been forced to make false confessions through torture. For him, torture was a symbol of superstition and arbitrariness that had to be overcome. At the same time, the understanding of law changed. The confession as the queen of evidence was increasingly replaced by the idea of rational evidence through circumstantial evidence, witnesses, and evidence. With this new logic, torture lost its apparent necessity. Political and social pressure to end the practice also grew. Reforms began in many countries. In Prussia, Frederick the Great banned torture in almost all cases in 1740. In Austria, Maria Theresa introduced the first restrictions, which finally led to its official abolition under her son Joseph II in 1776. France abolished torture in the 1780s, a few years before the Revolution. But the path was not equally fast everywhere. Some states stuck to the practice for a long time, and it also lived on in the colonies. But the direction was clear. Torture, once a solid pillar of justice, lost its legitimacy. The Enlightenment thus marked the first decisive break with a millennia-old tradition. It exposed torture as irrational, unjust, and incompatible with the new image of man. From then on, it was no longer a self-evident means of state violence, but a scandal that could not be reconciled with the ideals of freedom and human dignity. This change was not only a triumph of reason, but also an expression of profound social changes. People began to see themselves not only as subjects, but as citizens who possessed rights and dignity. In this new way of thinking, the state could no longer act as a torture master. The Enlightenment thus opened the way for the great reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries, which officially abolished torture in Europe. But, as history would show, this was not the end of torture, but only the beginning of a new phase in which it continued to live in secret. Chapter 13. The 18th and 19th Centuries, Reforms and Official Abolition. With the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, a profound change in the way torture was dealt with in Europe and many parts of the world. What had been an accepted means of criminal justice for centuries was now gradually abolished and replaced by new forms of punishment. This process was not abrupt, but a gradual transition, supported by the ideas of the Enlightenment, the political upheavals of the time, and the growing importance of human rights. The French Revolution of 1789 was a decisive turning point. With her call for liberty, equality, fraternity, she questioned not only the political order, but also the old practices of justice and punishment. In France, torture was officially abolished in the course of the revolution. Instead, the guillotine was used as a more humane form of execution. Even if it remained deadly, it was a step forward compared to the slow torments of the wheel or the torture of fire. Fast, equal for all classes, and free from long suffering. The development was similar in other European countries. Prussia had already severely restricted torture under Frederick the Great in 1740, and under his successors it was finally abolished. Austria followed suit under Emperor Joseph II in 1776 with a clear ban. In Spain, Italy, and the Scandinavian countries, it took longer, but everywhere the new attitude prevailed. By the 19th century, torture had officially largely disappeared in Europe. It was now regarded as a relic of barbarism, incompatible with the new concept of state and society. Instead, new forms of punishment and control emerged: prisons, workhouses, penitentiaries. The corporal punishment increasingly gave way to imprisonment. The body was no longer to be tortured in public, but disciplined and improved. Philosophy and jurisprudence also contributed to this development. Caesar Beccaris' ideas continued to have an effect, as did the writings of Montesquieu, Voltaire, and other Enlightenment thinkers. The idea that punishment should not serve revenge, but re-socialization gained in importance. But the abolition was by no means complete or final. On the one hand, in many parts of the world, especially in the colonies, practices persisted that could hardly be distinguished from torture. Colonial powers such as Great Britain, France, or Spain used violence to put down uprisings, force confessions, or enforce forced labor. What was considered overcome in Europe was often continued unabated in the colonies. On the other hand, torture itself changed. It did not simply disappear, but shifted into new contexts. Instead of public display, there was covert violence. Beatings during police interrogations, mistreatment in prisons, brutality against insurgents. Torture was officially outlawed, but unofficially it remained a tool of state violence. The 18th and 19th centuries therefore mark an important but imperfect step. For the first time in history, states officially declared that torture was no longer permitted. It disappeared from the law books, from the courtrooms, from the public squares. But it lived on in secret and was to experience a cruel return in the 20th century in totalitarian regimes and wars. Nevertheless, the reforms of this period are of central importance. They show that the idea of human rights and dignity did not remain just theory, but had practical consequences. For the first time in thousands of years, torture was recognized not as a necessary evil, but as a moral crime. This laid a foundation that later generations could refer to, even if reality often fell short of ideals.
Chapter 14. Torture in Colonialism, Rule Through Violence. Although the European states had officially abolished torture in their own legal systems in the 18th and 19th centuries, it lived on unabated in the colonies. There, it became clear that the abolition in Europe was based less on a universal understanding of human rights than on the idea that certain standards applied only to one's own population. In the colonial empires, different rules prevailed, and torture became a central instrument of oppression and domination. European expansion in Africa, Asia, and America was accompanied by violence. The colonial rulers had to secure their rule over large, often resistant populations. Rebellions, uprisings, and resistance to foreign rule were brutally suppressed. Torture was not only used for punishment, but also for intimidation and information gathering. A particularly gloomy example is the Congo Free State, which was under the personal rule of the Belgian king Leopold II at the end of the 19th century. Millions of people were forced to collect rubber there. Those who did not meet the required quota were mistreated, mutilated, or killed. Severed hands were presented as evidence that no ammunition had been wasted. This systematic violence was a form of industrial torture, a system of domination based on terror and pain. The British also resorted to torture in their colonies. In the Indian Rebellion of 1857, for example, insurgents were cruelly punished, tortured, or publicly executed in order to intimidate the population. Later, during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, British authorities systematically used torture to extract confessions and break resistance. Abuse, sexual violence, and electric shocks were part of the arsenal. France, on the other hand, made itself notorious for its torture practices in the Algerian War 1954 to 1962. The French army used torture across the board to interrogate members of the FLN independence movement. Electric shocks, waterboarding, beatings, and sexual violence were commonplace. Officially, torture was denied, but later numerous contemporary witnesses and historians confirmed its systematic use. The Algerian War thus became a symbol of double standards. France had long since banned torture in Europe, but continued to use it in the colonies. Colonial torture had several functions. First, it served to counter insurgency and gather information. Second, it was a means of intimidation. It showed the colonized population that any resistance was futile. Third, it had a symbolic dimension. It demonstrated the superiority of the colonial masters over the bodies and souls of the subjugated. Racism played a decisive role in this. The colonial powers often regarded the subjugated peoples as inferior and thus justified the use of force. What had become unthinkable in Europe was seen as legitimate in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. The double standard was obvious. Human rights were not universal, but only to those who were defined as civilized. Colonialism thus shows the dark side of the European Enlightenment and the alleged humanization of criminal law. While in Europe the guillotine and prison took the place of public torture, in the colonies the whip, the stretching bench, and the electric clamp remained in use. The official abolition of torture was by no means the end of its history. Rather, its brutality shifted to other regions of the world. Colonial violence shaped not only the relations of power, but also the cultures of remembrance. To this day, many societies are traumatized by the legacy of colonial torture. Testimonies of survivors, archaeological finds, and historical reports show how deep the pain reached and how systematically it was organized. Thus, the 19th and early 20th centuries proved to be a time of double reality. In Europe, torture was declared over, while in the colonies it was consciously practiced. This gap was to become even more pronounced in the 20th century, when totalitarian systems and world wars once again put torture at the center of global politics.
Chapter 15: Torture in Totalitarian Systems of the 20th Century. The 20th century brought forth new political orders that systematized violence and oppression on a previously unknown scale. Totalitarian systems in particular, National Socialism in Germany, Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and other dictatorships, made torture a central instrument of their rule. It was no longer just a means of finding the truth, but became part of a comprehensive apparatus of fear and control. Under National Socialism, torture was closely linked to the terror apparatus of the Gestapo and the SS. Even in the early years of the regime, political opponents, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, were taken into protective custody and interrogated in the basements of the Gestapo. Beatings, kicks, sleep deprivation, simulated drowning, or electric torture methods were part of everyday life. The aim was not only to enforce information, but also to crush any form of resistance. In the concentration camps, torture became a systematic part of terror. Prisoners were mistreated, beaten to death, or subjected to medical experiments that were, in fact, cruel torture. In the process, the body became the object of total availability. The camps served not only to exterminate, but also to demonstrate that the state had absolute power, to the point of complete dehumanization. Torture also played a central role in the Soviet Union under Stalin. During the Great Purges of the 1930s, millions of people were arrested, interrogated, and convicted in show trials. The confessions presented in these trials were almost always forced under torture. NKVD officers used beatings, hours-long interrogations, sleep deprivation, and other methods to construct evidence of alleged conspiracies. The torture here did not serve the truth, but political staging. It created the illusion of guilt where in reality there was only paranoia and power calculations. Other totalitarian systems also resorted to torture. In fascist Italy, Francoist Spain, the military dictatorships of Latin America, or Maoist China, opponents were tortured in order to force confessions or simply to be intimidated and broken. Everywhere the goal was similar: total control over society and the individual. New in the 20th century was the combination of torture with modern technologies and bureaucracies. Police apparatuses, secret services, and military organizations developed systematic methods that were documented, evaluated, and standardized. Electric shocks, solitary confinement, psychological attrition, experiments with drugs, all these were modern variations on an ancient practice. At the same time, torture took on a new dimension through the ideologies that justified it. Under National Socialism, violence was legitimized by racist delusion. Jews, Roma, political opponents were considered subhumans against whom any means were permitted. Under Stalinism, torture was justified by the idea of protecting the revolution. Every victim was presented as a necessary cleansing. Torture was no longer just a legal tool, but part of a totalitarian worldview that completely subordinated the individual to the state. The consequences were devastating. Millions of people suffered immeasurable agony. Many died from the abuse or from the long-term effects. Entire societies were shaped by the fear of torture and arrest. The body of the individual was no longer his own, but became the material of a system that claimed total availability. With the collapse of these systems after the Second World War and after the end of the Cold War, the crimes were uncovered and documented. Testimonies from survivors, reports from historians, and trials of perpetrators made it clear how much torture had been an integral part of totalitarian rule. The 20th century thus shows in all its harshness that the official abolition of torture in the 18th and 19th centuries by no means meant its end. It returned in new forms, industrialized, ideologized, systematized. And it left behind a legacy that continues to have an impact today, both in the memory of the victims and in the question of how societies can prevent torture from becoming part of state policy again.
Chapter 16: The Second World War, Gestapo and Concentration Camps, Industrial Torture. The Second World War was not only a military conflict of unprecedented proportions, but also a laboratory of violence in which torture was systematic, technically perfected, and used industrially. Especially in National Socialist Germany, torture played a central role in the ruling apparatus. It was no longer just a means of forcing confessions, but became part of a comprehensive strategy of repression, annihilation, and intimidation. The Gestapo, the secret state police, was at the center of this practice of violence. Their task was to track down political opponents, resistance groups, and enemies of the state. Interrogations in the Gestapo's basements were notorious. Sleep deprivation, hours of beatings, simulated drowning, electric shocks, and other methods were used to gather information. But often it was less about truth than about total submission. The torture was intended to break the will, spread fear, and create the feeling that no one was safe. In the concentration camps, torture became an everyday practice. The camps were places of total availability over the bodies of the prisoners. Beatings, forced labor to the point of exhaustion, medical experiments, systematic humiliation, all this was part of a system aimed at destruction and dehumanization. The experiments in camps such as Dachau or Auschwitz became particularly notorious, in which people were tortured under extreme conditions, supposedly in the name of science, but in fact as cruel torture. Torture under National Socialism had a double function. On the one hand, it served to control political opponents and occupied territories. Partisans, resistance fighters, or civilians in occupied countries such as Poland or France were interrogated and tortured in order to extort information. On the other hand, torture was part of the racist policy of extermination. Jews, Roma, homosexuals, the disabled, and other persecuted groups were systematically mistreated. Not because information was needed, but because their torment and death was part of the ideology. This industrial torture differed from previous practices in that it was embedded in a bureaucratic system. It was not a state of emergency, but routine, organized by authorities, documented in files, carried out according to the rules. The violence was depersonalized. Perpetrators followed orders, victims became numbers. The body was no longer a single subject, but material in a machine of annihilation. Prisoners of war were also affected. Millions of Soviet soldiers who were taken prisoner by the Germans were tortured, starved, and mistreated. Many died as a result of this treatment. Torture was not a means to an end here, but an expression of a policy that saw certain people as worthless. After the liberation of Europe, the Allies reported in detail on the atrocities. Trials such as the Nuremberg trials made the systematic use of torture visible and condemned it as a crime against humanity. This meant that torture was not only morally outlawed, but also legally punished internationally. But even on the side of the Allies, torture did not remain completely absent. Mistreatment also occurred in dealing with German prisoners of war or in colonial conflicts after the war. This shows that although the Second World War made the extent of Nazi torture visible, the practice itself was by no means limited to this regime. Nevertheless, the Second World War marked a special turning point. For the first time, torture was organized on an industrial scale and embedded in an extermination system that cost millions of lives. It was no longer just a tool, but a central component of a regime that had made violence the basis of its ideology. After 1945, the experiences of this time gave rise to the insight that torture was not only a problem of individual states, but a threat to humanity as a whole. This led directly to the emergence of international human rights law to outlaw torture, an issue that had a decisive impact on the post-war period and the 20th century.
Chapter 17: The Post-War Period and the Establishment of Human Rights. The horror of the Second World War, the revelations about the torture chambers of the Gestapo, and the atrocities of the concentration camps led to a historic turning point after 1945. For the first time in the history of mankind, there was a serious attempt not only to morally condemn torture, but also to prohibit it in a binding manner under international law. Out of the ruins of war grew the idea of universal human rights, which were supposed to guarantee every person protection from state arbitrariness and violence. A decisive moment was the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations in 1948. Article 5 contains an unequivocal formulation: no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. This was the first time that torture was categorically outlawed at the global level. This declaration was not only a moral confession, but also a response to the industrialized violence of the National Socialists. In the decades that followed, further agreements were created that specified protection against torture. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded the rights of prisoners of war and civilians and explicitly prohibited torture. They were supposed to ensure that rules that preserved humanity also applied in war. Later, regional human rights conventions followed, such as the European Convention on Human Rights of 1950, Article 3 of which also prohibits torture. But despite these legal advances, torture did not disappear from the world. Even in the early years of the Cold War, states secretly resorted to methods that were officially outlawed. Political opponents, spies, insurgents, or perceived enemies continued to be tortured. Only now it took place in secret, shielded from the public, as the international outlawing of torture made open use impossible. The post-war period was therefore marked by a double movement. On the one hand, progress in law, the codification of universal norms. On the other, the persistent reality that states continued to resort to torture. Especially in authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Asia, or Africa, it was part of everyday political oppression. But even in democratic states, mistreatment occurred in secret. Nevertheless, the anchoring of human rights had far-reaching consequences. For the first time, victims and their relatives were able to invoke international law. Courts such as the European Court of Human Rights, or later the International Criminal Court, offered opportunities to bring perpetrators to justice. Civil society also gained in importance. Organizations such as Amnesty International, founded in 1961, made torture visible worldwide and exerted pressure on governments. Another important signal was the UN Convention Against Torture of 1984, which obliged states not only to prohibit torture, but also to prevent, punish, and compensate victims. This once again tightened and concretized the ostracism. The post-war period thus shows a new phase in the history of torture. It had not disappeared, but it was ostracized, a fundamental difference from the centuries before when it was openly practiced and justified. From then on, it had to take place in secret, which did not make it any less cruel, but destroyed its political and moral legitimacy. At the same time, this period illustrates the fragility of progress. Human rights were not a matter of course, but had to be defended again and again. The experiences of dictatorships, civil wars, and secret service scandals in the second half of the 20th century made it clear that the danger of torture still existed, even in a world that had officially banned it. Thus, the post-war period marked a paradoxical epoch. It brought the prohibition of torture to the heart of international law, but reality showed that the practice lived on in a new form. The idea of human rights was born, but its promise remained incomplete, an area of tension that still exists today.
Chapter 18. Torture in the Cold War, Secret Services and Psychological Methods. The Cold War, which divided the world into two power blocks from 1945 to 1990, was not only a geopolitical struggle between East and West, but also a time in which torture took on new, sophisticated forms. While the official ostracism by the human rights treaties continued to exist, secret services, the military and police apparatuses developed methods that no longer relied on visible scars but on invisible destruction. Psychological torture, isolation, manipulation, and subtle techniques took place alongside the classic forms of physical violence. In the Soviet Union, torture remained an integral part of the political system. The KGB used interrogations with sleep deprivation, prolonged isolation, and systematic humiliation. Dissidents who criticized the regime were not only imprisoned, but also forcibly committed to psychiatric hospitals. There, they were treated with drugs that destroyed their personalities, a particularly perfidious form of psychological torture that pretended to be a cure but actually served to eliminate opposition. Torture did not remain absent in the West either, albeit in secret. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA developed methods to manipulate the human mind as part of the MK-Ultra project. Drug testing, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electric shocks have been tested to develop new forms of control. Officially, it was about defense against Soviet espionage, but in fact, it was a matter of human experiments that caused severe psychological damage. A particularly influential document was the CIA's so-called Kubark Manual from the early 1960s. In it, methods of psychological torture were described in detail: isolation, manipulation of time and space, sleep deprivation, humiliation, simulated drowning. The aim was to break the will of the victims without leaving any visible traces. These techniques spread worldwide and were used in many allied countries. In the global South, where the Cold War was often fought in the form of proxy wars, torture centers were ubiquitous. In Latin America, especially in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, military dictatorships set up torture chambers in which opposition members disappeared. Electric shocks, waterboarding, sexual violence, and mock executions were standard. Many of these regimes have been supported or trained by Western intelligence agencies in the name of the fight against communism. Torture was also used on the side of the Eastern Bloc, for example in the satellite states of Eastern Europe, where secret services such as the Stasi in the GDR or the Securitate in Romania put dissidents under pressure. Here, psychological attrition, permanent surveillance, and subtle intimidation were in the foreground. Methods that aimed to break people not through open violence, but through constant control. The Cold War thus brought a new quality, the refinement of torture. While earlier eras relied on physical cruelty, the emphasis now increasingly shifted to invisible torment. Sleep deprivation, isolation, sensory overload, or total incapacity could break the will just as effectively as whipping or screwing, but without any visible evidence that could have surfaced in international courts. At the same time, resistance to these practices grew. Organizations such as Amnesty International documented torture worldwide and made it public. The media increasingly reported on disappeared opposition members, on torture centers in South America, or on the role of Western intelligence services. This created a new awareness. Torture was no longer just a domestic political issue, but a global problem that demanded international attention. The Cold War thus shows the ambivalence of modernity. On the one hand, the claim to have finally overcome torture through international agreements. On the other hand, their covert further development through secret services and dictatorships. The torture became more subtle, more sophisticated, but no less destructive. It was directed less against the body than against the mind, and thus made it clear that the line between physical and psychological can hardly be drawn when it comes to the destruction of a human being.
Chapter 19: Torture in the 21st Century. War on Terror and Modern Debates. The 21st century began with an event that shook the world order: the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 in the United States. The answer to this was the so-called War on Terror, which brought with it not only military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also a return of torture to the political life of Western democracies. What had been officially outlawed for centuries was reapplied in a new form, this time under the pretext of security. The USA played a central role in this. In the course of hunting down members of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, the CIA set up a worldwide network of secret prisons, the so-called black sites. In these secret facilities in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, suspects were detained without trial, without rights, often without contact with the outside world. Methods were used there that were not officially called torture, but in reality were just that. One of the most notorious methods was waterboarding, in which the victim is put into a suffocation panic without actually drowning. Sleep deprivation for days, stress positions, beatings, sexual humiliation, and sensory deprivation added to the arsenal. These techniques were euphemistically referred to as enhanced interrogation techniques in order to conceal their illegality. The notorious Guantanamo Bay prison camp in Cuba became a symbol of this policy. Hundreds of men, suspected of being terrorists, were held there for years without charge or trial. Reports of abuse, isolation, and humiliation made the rounds and led to outrage worldwide. The Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq also became notorious when pictures were published in 2004 showing American soldiers mistreating and humiliating Iraqi prisoners. These photos revealed not only individual brutality, but also a system that tolerated, if not encouraged, abuse. The revelations triggered international debates. Governments, lawyers, and human rights organizations accused the U.S. and its allies of violating the Geneva Conventions and the UN Convention Against Torture. Officially, politicians justified the methods with the need to prevent terrorist attacks. But critics pointed out that information obtained under torture was often unreliable, and that the use itself was a moral defeat. Other states have also resorted to torture in the 21st century, partly under the pretext of fighting terrorism, partly as a means of control. In Syria, Egypt, and China, prisoners were systematically mistreated. And in Russia, opposition members and journalists reported torture by security services. Torture was by no means limited to authoritarian regimes, but there it was particularly brutal and open. A central feature of modern debates is the shift of torture into obscurity. While it was openly staged in the pre-modern era, today it is officially outlawed and must take place in secret. This makes their detection difficult and their existence all the more scandalous. The modern public reacts sensitively. Even a single scandal can discredit a government internationally. At the same time, the question of psychological torture became more important. Isolation, sleep deprivation, total surveillance. These methods leave no physical traces, but are just as destructive. This makes them the focus of legal debates as to whether they fall under the term torture or not. Human rights organizations emphasize that the difference is artificial. Any systematic infliction of suffering to break the will is torture. The 21st century thus presents a paradoxical situation. Never before has the outline of torture been so clearly formulated in international law. At the same time, it continues to be practiced, no longer as a public ritual, but as a secret practice legitimized by the discourse of security. Modern torture is more subtle, more technical, more veiled, but its goal has remained the same: to break the human being. The debates about Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and the CIA's torture programs have made it clear that the question of torture is not a historical one, but a current one. It touches on the core of our values. How far can a state go to ensure security? And doesn't he lose his moral legitimacy if he himself resorts to the means he officially condemns in the name of protection?
Chapter 20. Conclusion. The remaining danger and the fight against torture today. The history of torture is as old as organized society itself. From the early advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and Rome, the Middle Ages with the Inquisition and witch trials, the atrocities of the early modern period, the criticism of the Enlightenment and the official abolitions in the 18th and 19th centuries, to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century and the modern forms of the war on terror, there is a common thread. The torture never completely disappears. It only changes its shape. For thousands of years, it has been legitimized by religion, by law, by ideology, or by reasons of state. There have always been reasons why it was believed that the suffering of the individual was necessary: to obtain truth, to secure order, to appease gods, to prevent revolutions, or to thwart terrorist attacks. Torture was a mirror of power. It showed how far a state or society was willing to go to maintain its order. But at the same time, the history of torture has always been a history of resistance. Even in ancient times, there were philosophers who doubted their reliability. Martyrs of early Christianity made their torment symbols of faith. Humanists and Enlightenment thinkers such as Beccaria and Voltaire exposed the contradictions between justice and cruelty. After the horrors of the Second World War and totalitarian systems, the international community formulated universal human rights, with a clear ban on torture. Today,
Torture is officially outlawed in all countries of the world, but practice shows a different picture. In authoritarian regimes, it continues to be part of everyday life. In democracies, it comes back as an exception, often hidden behind euphemisms such as enhanced interrogation methods. Psychological torture, isolation, and surveillance take the place of visible torment. The fight against torture is not over. It is waged anew every century. The enduring danger lies in the temptation to justify torture in the name of a greater good. Security, truth, order, these are terms that have been used again and again to try to conceal injustice. But history shows that torture does not bring truth. It destroys trust, humanity, and dignity. It dehumanizes not only the victims, but also the perpetrators and the society that allows them. At the same time, humanity has made progress. Never before has awareness of human rights been so strong. Never before has international condemnation been so clear. Organizations, media, courts, and activists make torture visible, denounce it, and put pressure on governments. Today, victims are given a voice that was previously denied to them. The conclusion of this long history is therefore that torture is not a relic of the past, but an enduring challenge. It is an expression of human cruelty, but also a touchstone for our values. Whether a society respects human dignity is shown by whether it not only prohibits torture, but also consistently combats it. In courts, in prisons, in secret rooms, and on the battlefields of the world. The history of torture is dark, but it also contains the hope that humanity can be stronger than violence. Every reform, agreement, every courageous vote against the torments was a step forward. The fight is not over, but it proves that torture is not fate, but a decision, and that it is always possible to act differently.